Hello, and welcome to Sonata She Wrote. Today I am joined by Dr. Mike Harley. He's a professor at the University of South Carolina. He teaches bassoon and chamber music. He is the sort of impresario manager of a concert series called Southern Exposure that features new music and new musicians. He is the bassoonist in the new music ensemble Alarm Will Sound, and along with several other excellent bassoonists, teaches at the New Bassoon Institute at the University of Michigan every summer. Dr. Harley, I'm going to call you Mike if that's okay. How are you?
Dude, thanks, Dan. It's great to see you, talk to you again, and I think we should fill in the listeners on our more personal connection, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say, actually, anyone watching will probably see, well, obviously, instantly be able to tell that I am in the painting that's behind Mike right there. And I am a
Yeah.
former student of his.
And as Dan likes to point out, he is playing principal bassoon in that
Mm-hmm.
in that picture, along with and that's me in the middle, and then there's a serpent friend of ours, serpent player
Yeah.
friend of ours, and on the end, Craig Crydell. But anyway, yeah. So Dan, uh, I'm sure you put this very first in your bio too, is that you were a student here at University of South Carolina years ago,
Yeah, well, I don't list my undergrads. So.
right? And you did, your master's from here, and I have to tell a tiny story,
Oh, please.
which is your very famous application to the University of South Carolina, in which, in his personal essay, Dan wrote something, I don't remember the details, it was something about consorting with your torrid mistress music. I know torrid mistress music was in there.
Yeah,
I
definitely
remember
the word
thinking,
mistress.
yeah. And I remember thinking, I have to have this student come here.
Yeah. I
Didn't
don't
matter how
know.
you played at that point. It was your writing and it was the torrid mistress part. Of
Yeah,
course, a very fine player as well, but the writing was what really got me.
that is really a crazy thing to put in a cover letter. I don't know what I was.
It seemed to work. It provided the entire committee with entertainment too when you actually came to the audition. I think you
Yeah,
gave some crap about that, but anyway, it was really good. So, but yeah,
great.
congratulations on what you're doing and this, uh, following your career from afar. This is great, and I'm really honored to be a part of this podcast and
Great.
talk about the Mozart Bassoon Concerto.
Yeah, so today we are going to discuss Ritornello form briefly, type 5 sonatas, and using the analysis of the Mozart Bassoon Concerto.
Cool.
So I'll just start. I don't want to, this isn't like revenge of the comprehensive exams. So let me just read you a definition and we can talk about it.
All right.
This is the Grove definition of a concerto. So this is an instrumental work that maintains contrast between an orchestral ensemble and a smaller group or a solo instrument, or among various groups of an undivided orchestra. My kind of perspective of that is that concertos are offshoots of this kind of like 17th century sonata sinfonia that turns into a feature for a soloist.
Well, and especially, I guess my understanding has always been, especially starting with the Concerto Grossos, or do we say
Mm-hmm.
Concerto Grossi, perhaps, of of the Baroque, the primary idea being, of course, the offsetting of the solo group or the soloist with the tutti, with the orchestra. And what I've always been confused about when thinking about even what a concerto is or what that word meant
Mm.
when it was first used was I remember learning two very distinct definitions.
Okay.
And actually, and and uh, and I had to look this up in preparation for today because I didn't want to, of course, I didn't want to come on here and say, well, I learned that the concerto is this or what
Mm-hmm.
have you. And it turns out, I guess, that both definitions are correct in some sense, and that I was dealing with the difference between the Latin use of the word concertare and the Italian concertare, I suppose, um, is, the first thing I remember learning about when I first learned about a concerto, and this is one of those very, very few things that kind of sticks with me from even my undergrad, I think, is that, oh, this is like it's a battle between opposing forces, right?
Mm.
This
Mm.
is about the contrast between these two things, which okay, I remember thinking, and I knew enough about the concerto at the time. Oh, this is something that features a soloist was kind of what I knew. I
Mhm.
thought that seemed like a kind of a strange definition, but okay, I'll take that. But the idea of opposition was interesting. And
Yeah.
then later, I remember hearing, oh, the concerto is about it means to bring into agreement or something, right? Which I
Mhm.
guess is more derived from the Italian. And so in doing a little reading about it, I still honestly remained a little confused. But it seems as if the Italian may have been first may have developed from the word's original meaning. So we're talking about kind of the harmony that emerges from the opposition.
Yeah. So we're talking about opposing forces
Yeah,
that eventually come together, really.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I'm actually since you that's so interesting because I'm going to just read you this section from Sonata Theory really quickly, and maybe I'll put the page number on the screen. But it begins to which larger social ends were these solo group interactions staged? Were Mozart's audiences and are we today invited most centrally to identify with the emotional stance of the soloist, thus helping to construct their modern sense of subjectivity around the eloquent presence of an individual voice? Or were they, and also we, also identifying with the more composite sonic image of the claims of both the individual and the group? And then they finish that there is an implied discourse between group and individual within each of Mozart's concertos can scarcely be denied. So don't even deny it.
I would never want to deny that. Well, yeah, I guess I think we need to be able to have it both ways, and maybe within each piece, you're going to have moments where it seems like the soloist. This is all about the individual here. Maybe even as sort of an individual against society, and in other moments, we are focusing on the harmony between the individual and society and the way these things can complement each other and come together. I mean, I don't know. That's interesting. We're with Mozart, we're in the Enlightenment, and I suppose there's more awareness, right? The idea of the individual is coming to the fore,
Mm-hmm.
and clearly to me, when as a bassoonist, as a player, hey, this piece is about me.
Yeah.
you know, so if I had to like, clearly this is a vehicle, or at least becomes a vehicle eventually. That's I don't know if it's more about the soloist, but it's clearly everything I think in from an audience perspective. This is a feature. This is
Mm-hmm.
this
Mm-hmm.
is this person's moment, and then I think we must hear the piece in relation to that idea. So if I had
Yeah.
to choose one scale or the other, I might say it's a little bit more about the soloist and how, like that, he or she is the main character here in this drama. And then we're looking at, yeah, that relationship that the composer puts forth that we hear in the piece itself. Is the soloist kind of taking what uh, the orchestra provides? Are they arguing with the orchestra?
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
dialogue is happening?
Yeah. And kind of going off of that, um, just because I remember being your student, how do you communicate the idea of the soloist versus the ensemble more in the Baroque concerto form that involves a ritornello, like alternating sections of soloist and tutti?
The thing I stress in teaching, look, you can get into form and some of these ideas in different levels, of course, depending on the kind of student you have, how much theory background they have, even where they are in their sequence of courses at school.
Mm-hmm.
But I always do stress I want students to have a basic idea of the tonal plan. And what's significant for me is, hey, in the Vivaldi Ritornello stuff, for example, as maybe the listeners know, we have like 39 uh,
Mm-hmm.
concertos
Kind
by,
of a big deal.
or perhaps one concerto written 39 different ways. As some people,
No,
I know, I'm sorry, I shouldn't
no
say.
one,
I,
no one
I
would say that.
sorry, I know, but they're all different. They are
No,
actually.
there's a major one and a minor one.
A bunch of sure, okay, so two concertos. There we go, and more. more major ones, that's for sure. But yeah, they're what, eight in C major or something. And but
Yeah,
anyway,
there's yeah.
what was okay. So in terms of what I do talk about, and I think is important about Vivaldi and like Ritornello form, is that the soloist really grabs control of the thing because the soloist and only the soloist can control the modulation.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, the ritornello is laid out, and I think it's always in the same. It's in the same key. It doesn't move around when it's first presented, and then the soloist might take us to another key, and then the ritornello, when it returns, might be in another key. But it's always the modulation is led by the soloist, and that I think is emblematic of a certain amount of power there. It's important.
Yeah, the orchestra is really a reactionary kind of responding to what the soloist, like the soloist's agency within the piece.
That's a much better way of saying it. Yeah, yeah, that's great. Or a great.
Well,
That's a beautiful way of saying it.
I was prepared for this, so. Well, so I think the way to think of this type 5 form that we're going to talk about, which is, you could call it concerto form loosely, is that it is really heavily based in the Baroque ritornello form. So
Okay.
even though we're going to be dealing with the sonata form, which I know you're familiar with,
Yeah.
the modifications to it involve how it interacts with the ritornello form. And there's a lot of carrying through of that idea of the soloist as the main agent of change. And the orchestra is more of a responsory kind
Okay.
of element, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And the idea, honestly, I mean, this, I haven't thought so much about the impact or looking for elements of ritornello form in the Mozart. You know, I think my education here was pretty siloed. It's like, okay, this is a classical piece, so let's look for a sonata form.
Mm-hmm.
And then within the sonata form, which is this famous three-part form, composers are sometimes going to do different things, and that's what's interesting. But we always, I don't know that I ever have looked at it closely in a way that also relates like this earlier, like the Ritornello form. So that
Yeah.
of itself, that's quite helpful. I think that's going to be quite helpful in thinking about the piece.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's also, I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but that's also one of the features of sonata theory is that the forms are essentially in dialogue with the past and with each other as they're written around them. So Mozart is responding to like Haydn's treatment of forms,
Yeah.
and Mozart's also responding to Bach and Handel, who he was also aware of as a composer.
Hmm. I wonder
Probably
what
less so Vivaldi.
Vivaldi actually. I don't know. It's not something one hears about.
I know that there are some famous Vivaldi concerti that were made famous by Bach transcriptions.
Hmm.
And so he may have been aware of those, but I don't think Vivaldi had a renaissance until like the early 20th century.
Huh. Yeah. Well, you know, you hear about um, composers like in Vivaldi's time being influenced him, by him, but you don't hear it like Bach, for example. But you don't hear as
Mm-hmm.
much about that influence on Mozart. You hear about J.C. Bach and
Yeah.
Haydn. But yeah, he's writing a bassoon concerto. Probably was aware that Vivaldi had written a bunch, but
It seems like
uh,
it would have been. But he couldn't have Googled it, so who knows?
thank God. Actually.
Yeah, maybe that's for the best. Just to give like a brief rundown of what a Type 5 sonata is before we kind of dive into the Mozart. Um, a Type 5 sonata is going to have a 2D, or we'll call it the Ritornello, non-modulatory exposition. So this is going to have kind of the hallmarks of a normal exposition. There'll be a primary theme, a secondary theme, and a cadence. But crucially, it will not modulate. So it will be in dialogue with the Ritornello forms, single tonic for the Ritornello section.
Mhm.
And then the exposition will conclude with a soloist led exposition that will modulate. The soloist has the power of modulation.
Yeah, and that idea is coming right from Ritornello form.
Yeah. And even within, the Type 5 sonata, like elsewhere on my channel, if you're a Sonata She Wrote super fan,
Exactly.
I yeah, and those exist. They're out there. Yeah. I analyzed the first movement of the Brahms piano concerto, the second concerto, and that uses a type 5 sonata form sort of as a pastiche to Mozart. And part of the drama of the initial exposition is that the orchestra actually tries to modulate, and
Yeah,
the soloist eventually has to come in and say, no, this is a concerto, you are not modulating, that's my job.
interesting.
And it's sort of interesting how that dialogue is kind of reinvigorated by Brahms.
Right. Well, so is this the is this the the most standard concerto form for Mozart? Really, with the wind concertos, or
Well, that's an interesting question. This type 5 kind of sonata is really a Mozart innovation.
okay?
And the bassoon concerto might be one of the earliest pieces that he really can be said to use it. The if you don't know, the bassoon concerto was written when Mozart was about 18.
Yeah, yeah.
I know that you know. Um,
One doesn't matter. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Um, so there are sort of in between composers like CPE and JC Bach. There's some early Haydn concerti that are actively in Ritornello form. Essentially, if you find a Mozart concerto and it's past like RK number, past 180 or so, it's going to be a type 5 probably.
Huh.
And the tradition of like a mandatory type 5 sonata continues all the way through Beethoven and kind of ends around Mendelssohn.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I love that to hear about Mozart as innovator, frankly, because another thing I remember learning about Mozart as well, he's not as much of an innovator. He kind of takes what he's given and sort of creates this supreme manifestation of all of these
Yeah.
styles
Like a great
or movements
synthesizer.
that he's basic, but he's not doing a lot new. So it's cool to hear about Mozart as something of an innovator.
I mean, I I feel like that's probably just the reality of his role as a composer and having to like live and really exist in a space where that's his job.
Yeah,
When you're churning pieces out,
yeah,
how much innovation are you doing? But at the same time, when you look into his catalog, especially when you look at pieces where he was deliberately trying to impress with the concerto, which the concertos usually are,
yeah.
that's where you find a lot of innovation.
Cool.
In my experience, anyway.
Well, before we dive in, can you answer one question for me?
I would love to.
Um, do you, there's speculation this was written for von Dönitz, who he wrote later pieces for.
Mm-hmm.
I've always found that to be strange because, in my understanding, he didn't maybe visit Munich, where von Dönitz was, until after this piece was written. But I don't. Do you know anything about that, or is this still lost to history? Who he might have written this
I
for?
think it's officially lost to history, but I am aware of the other bassoonist in Mozart's life. That I think it's Ritter.
Yeah, Ritter.
Yeah, and he definitely wrote bassoon concerti for Ritter, and they are unfortunately lost to time.
Okay.
And he would have been in Mannheim when he was, I think, 17, because it was before he went to Paris.
Oh, well then
So
maybe this would have been related to Ritter then.
yeah, it's definitely possible this is for
Okay.
him. And then I think the other option is, I assume the name that you just said I can never remember. That guy who was like an aristocrat that played the bassoon as a hobby.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a little too hard, I feel like, for a hobbyist, but maybe he
Yeah.
was very good.
Well, it is hard, of course, especially imagining one imagines playing it on like a seven key bassoon or something. But it's not an easy piece, and there's a reason why this first movement, especially as the exposition, is used in really every single orchestral audition.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just hard to make it sound so easy, and yeah,
But I think that kind of is a point in the favor of it being written for a professional, because I'm aware of some Mozart piano concerti that are written for his students, and there's a noticeable drop in difficulty level. Like
yeah,
I feel like he knew how to make those adjustments.
yeah. Well, maybe a paper is in order arguing this was for Ritter or something. Well, I know Ritter, he wrote the Symphony Concertante for Ritter and the other. I thought.
Yeah, I don't want to snipe you out or anything, but the Sinfonia Concertana has been
Oh
debunked as a
no!
Mozart piece. Yeah.
What?
It's not actually Mozart.
Paper I wrote about it when I was in grad school is just all wrong then.
Well, listen, I actually wrote a paper for a music history class, and the professor wrote like this paper's okay, but that's the piece isn't by Mozart. It's like, oh geez, sorry.
That goes to show there were a lot of great composers back then in addition to Mozart. We've lost track of many of them. We need to keep playing
Yeah,
more.
and that's really a good piece too. So
Yeah, it is. I like that piece.
yeah. So
Cool.
should we? I don't know. Do you have any other questions about this sort of Ritornello type five kind of thing, or should we discuss it in specific relation to the
I feel
concerto?
like I don't even know enough about it to know what questions to ask really beyond of course looking for the integration of like Ritornello ideas
Okay,
in in the you know in the three-part concerto form. So yeah.
great.
Um,
So let's jump into it, and if I'll put images of the score on the screen. So if you can feel free to say like a specific measure number,
okay.
anything like that.
Cool.
I kind of want to go over the labeling quickly because I know that it can be confusing. Essentially, all the labels will fall into um, two categories, and each category is going to be on either side of a backslash. So on the one side of the backslash, we'll have Ritornello 1, Ritornello 2, etc., solo 1, solo 2, etc. And that will indicate which section it's from, actually, which section it appeared in first. So a theme that appears in Ritornello 1 will always be marked Ritornello 1. So, for example, the first theme in this symphony, the primary theme, is always the primary theme. So it will always be marked Ritornello 1 P.
Gotcha.
So either side of the backslash indicates whether it's the Ritornello that we're talking about or the part of the sonata form we're talking about.
So even if the main theme from the Ritornello returns in the solo part, it's still called the Ritornello theme.
Yeah.
It's still labeled R1 or something.
So you'll know we're in solo 2 because the score is labeled solo 2.
Gotcha.
But the primary theme itself will be labeled R1 colon backslash P, which is, of course, what the concerto opens with.
Yeah. Which is this great yum bum ba da da.
Mm-hmm.
This really appealing and kind of dramatic announcing sort of opening.
Yeah,
Uh,
very almost operatic, I think.
yeah. When
Um,
this I will say just for if bassoonists listen to this, maybe some will, because it's about the Mozart concerto.
oh, they
Because
definitely will.
we all know it's like these two, probably the first two notes, the way we play those first two notes. Like I have probably spent an entire lesson on just those first two notes. It becomes quite the topic of preoccupation. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it's this on starting on the downbeat, not a pickup, but on the downbeat, quarter, half, bum bum, short, long, I guess iambic sort of rhythm. And the best way that I've been able to conceive of it myself to execute it the way I want to anyway, and the way that
Mm-hmm.
it helps students. Maybe we even talked about this in lessons, Dan, is thinking of of two cello down bows. Yum,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because I feel like you don't want that downbeat to sound like a pickup, which can
Yeah.
be especially problematic if you're really playing this without the orchestra, right? Just playing it as a solo. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't want it to have more weight, I think, than the second note. And so we want this kind of two forceful notes, bomb, bomb, probably equal weight, and
Yeah.
that's just to achieve on the instrument. And so yeah, I think of that this theme, which really in a way becomes a motto that we hear elsewhere. I think in other themes occasionally,
Yeah.
well, in the piece, it's so important. We've got to be able to play that well. I
Mm-hmm.
think of the two down bows there. So
Yeah. And I think especially this might jog your memory from my struggles playing this concerto with you, is that the when you're a student, I think you really want to play it in kind of an individualized way,
right.
but you almost can't.
It's hard. Yeah.
You're I mean, or you maybe you can, but you're definitely in a small box with limited options, I think,
I
because
think
the piece is so sacrosanct as our piece.
it is. It is. And of course, there must be other perfectly legitimate ways of of hearing
Hmm.
it and of playing it, but it's certainly rare to find them. And I know my own interpretation has been pretty calcified over the years, and I feel like, oh, nope, everything else, two down bows, come on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, if one can play something that's really compelling and convincing, then it's different. I'll always take that, and it's
Hmm.
your individuality, but it has to be especially simply at you, and maybe that's better if you're playing the concerto. But if you're in an audition, as you well know, we do have to be aware of that box sometimes too. And
I definitely.
there are other couple other bassoonists sitting there on the committee that probably play it this way. So
Well, and not only the bassoonist on the committee, but anyone else on the committee has heard it 60
yeah,
times that day.
yeah, exactly.
So,
And probably almost always in a similar way. So Dan, I see that you have marked starting in bar 6 this transition,
mhm.
which I agree with in principle. But this is, I think, an area of weakness in my study where I've never, I felt like we analyzed pieces and that you kind of bypass talking about what happens in the transition and even how to identify it and what's a
Mhm.
transition, and what's important is the themes. You got the first theme, and then we're going to have another theme, and or you have the first theme group and the second theme group, or what have you. Those
Yeah.
That's the terminology I learned. Uh,
Mhm.
Related entirely by first theme group means it's always in the starting key, the tonic, and then the second theme group is identified because we've moved to the dominant, typically in major keys,
Mhm.
or moved to major 3 in minor keys. But transitions, getting back to that and starting in measure 6 through, I guess, measure 11,
Yeah.
um, or 10. Tell, I would love for you to talk a little bit about them and how they function musically.
Yeah. I do think transitions are kind of a different part that are there. I don't know if they're specific to sonata theory, but they definitely go into depth about what they are and how to identify them. So I have another quote from the book here. It's from the chapter on the transition. It's called The Transition, if you can believe it. So they write certain kinds of TR, that's transition, TR, rhetoric, again, particularly in compositions in allegro tempi or faster, are readily recognizable as transitional in texture, which you can probably just tell orally from listening to
Okay.
it.
Yeah.
These include motivic, Fortspannung, sequential activity, accumulative rhetorical energy. So that could be like an increase in the just rhythmic values on the screen or, the page really.
Which clearly happens here. You got the string,
Yeah, exactly. The
bustling
16th
string
notes.
16ths here, which are quite exciting.
And a drive towards a structural dominant. So that would be if we were modulating, which we're not, we would be moving towards the dominant in transition, and perhaps a concern for modulation. Once this sort of rhetoric is underway, there's never any doubt about it being a transition. But the problematic issue rather is when may we consider the transition to have begun?
Hmm.
So
Okay.
I think that's kind of something that sonata theory is sort of a little concerned with is finding the borders between these zones. And they can sometimes be a little wiggly. But I think in this one, especially because it sort of begins and ends with this very Mozartian cadential elision, where the primary theme ends and a new section starts.
Right.
That sort of makes the border easy to identify.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. And well, and just the texture change,
Yeah.
you know, um, is really significant here.
Hmm.
And I was just thinking about how the theme, right, which is in the violins, it's kind of truncated. The second half of the theme, in the bassoon, it goes on, just like that. It's like this interruption to me, but I guess that's hearing it in retrospect.
Yeah, I think if we kind of reset our minds
Yeah,
and just think, all I'm hearing is these five measures, which you might think to yourself, that's kind of a different phrase length, Mozart. I don't know.
yeah,
But I don't think you wouldn't think to yourself like, well, someone else is surely going to fill in the rest of this phrase structure later. Some heroic figure
yeah.
waiting to
Of course
change our
not.
society.
But I do think we still hear a kind of interruption maybe in bar
Yeah.
six. You know, the music's just singing along, and then all of a sudden we got these fiery.
Yeah, there's a change, definitely.
So to me, I could see why you decided this is where this thing starts here
Hmm.
in this case, you know.
Yeah. And as to where it ends, in sonata theory, we end sections like a transition with a medial caesura,
Okay.
which, as far as I know, is sonata theory specific. Do you have any previous experience with
It's
a medial caesura?
that's not something I remember learning about. You're talking about measure 10
Yeah, that's measure 10.
with the kind of a cadence there.
Yeah, so we have a half cadence, which is by far the most normative option for a medial caesura, a half cadence.
Okay.
Um, and then there, in the silence that is created kind of by the strings, there's sort of a fanfare in the oboes and the horns.
Right.
Yeah. And
Okay.
it's essentially kind of clearing the way for the secondary theme.
Yeah, that's a great point. It and again, I you can hear this in my head. Um,
Mhm.
it's like that gesture, bum ba dum bum bum. It's like setting the stage for something
Yeah.
to happen. That makes total sense, as you said, clearing the way for
Mhm.
this secondary theme for the second theme to come in here.
Yeah. And sort of something about sonata theory that I think is hard to hear when you're first kind of engaging with it is when you're presented with a normative option, which is what this medial caesura in this is, like it's very normative, it almost just completely goes away. You don't even notice it. But the reason it's important is because later, perhaps even in this movement, we'll have a deformative medial caesura, and then we'll need to know this is the normative option, and that's why this is deformative.
All right. Okay. Cool. Well, that's really interesting. And here is where I could start maybe to see when I think of what Ritornello form means to me, it's like these kind of relatively short ideas
Yeah.
that like a Baroque composer would sort of cycle through.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's how it differentiates. It's different than in more later music. We have these kind of longer lived, fully
Yeah.
formed things, and there's this theme. But here in the Mozart, we have pretty short little chunks of ideas.
Yeah, it's very in dialogue with like a Ritornello
Yeah,
2D.
yeah,
Every section is very segmented and there's no expansion really. That'll happen later.
right. As a teacher, I often it's maybe the easiest thing to focus on when talking about um, theory stuff is the idea of motive
Mm-hmm.
and the return of like that opening motto, bum bum, or certain little motivic gestures. And I want to point out, and I'm sure you're totally well aware of this, but like something one thinks about is how the little melodic gesture that begins at the end of bar four, that keeps coming
Mm-hmm.
back here in slightly different guises, and it hits you right in beat three of bar 12 in the secondary theme. You've called this, yeah, R1 secondary theme. Bum, bum,
Yeah.
bum, 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 ba-da-da-da-dum, bum. So we're having this kind of motivic unity
Yeah, yeah.
here
There's
between ideas, which is
things are
cool.
growing out of each other. Absolutely.
I guess that's what right. It makes it sound more organic.
Mm-hmm.
But that gesture, I think that little descending fourth is important.
Yeah, I think even if we compare the first bar to the sixth bar, like if I'm looking at the violin part in the sixth bar,
Right.
what I hear there is the melody is the B flat on beat one and three, and then
Mm.
we go up to the third in the fourth bar or the fourth beat, which is very similar to the first bar of the concerto. Da 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 da. So that kind of it's almost like a similar sort of
Yeah,
motive.
I wouldn't have noticed that. That's great. That makes sense. Cool.
Student becomes the master.
Clearly, to me, this is good. This is what I want to have happen. Ideally, this is the ultimate,
Yeah,
right? But
you're
anyway,
really living the dream.
good job. I just, what I love is just to get schooled by my students. That's what I look forward to.
Well, when I've been schooled so many times that
You're welcome.
um
This is great though.
Yeah, so I think the secondary theme, what is notable about it in the Ritornello exposition as it goes on
Right.
is that at the point where we are really expecting it to cadence, where we're sort of set up with this cadential 5 6 4 progression, um,
Right.
Mozart kind of pulls the rug out from under us, and there's an eighth rest on the downbeat, and there's no tonic in the soprano voice. Instead, we have the fifth, this F.
Okay, like an eighth rest on the downbeat of the bass in the bass line.
So
Yeah,
it kind of weakens that rhetorical moment.
and I see, and this analysis makes total sense. Again, this is not it's not something I remember, and it could be actually something that I've just forgotten in the midst of time. This idea of cadences kind of being evaded. It's certainly something I think about, but I don't remember that being articulated
Mm-hmm.
when I was a student, or certainly something we didn't focus on a lot. But I totally get that. Bum, 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 bum. It's like the winds interrupt all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's almost as if the winds are saying like, don't don't even try to get structural without me.
Yeah,
you know.
it is a concerto, so maybe they're.
Yeah, they're involved.
Uh,
But of course, there's no. It's sort of like just kind of tripping up a little
yeah,
bit on your way because the real cadence is only 4 bars later.
okay, gotcha. And I guess the winds are just doubling the violins here, but nonetheless, we hear that entrance, really clearly, kind of interrupting.
Yeah, and I think especially when you're adding winds to a texture that had been all strings, that's very noticeable.
Okay, so tell
Um,
me, can you please, uh, yet another, some more terminology I'm not super familiar with. We do finally get to this pack, this perfect authentic cadence
mhm.
28, and this is called the essential expository cadence, the EEC.
Yes, thank you
I
for
would
asking
love
about
for
that.
you to tell me about that. It must be significant because apparently it's essential.
Yeah, it's absolutely essential.
Okay,
Um, so again, I'll just read a little excerpt from the good book.
your
Uh,
Bible.
yeah, this is from chapter 7, which is about the secondary theme. Um,
Oh,
one central feature of sonata theory is its emphasis after the onset of the secondary theme on the attainment of the first satisfactory perfect authentic cadence that proceeds onwards to differing material.
gotcha.
So we're at the first PAC that proceeds onto material that's different from the secondary theme. So that's what the EEC is. But why it matters, this is the moment that we term essential expositional closure, the EEC.
Right.
It is toward the accomplishing of this PAC, marking the end of the secondary theme, that we understand all of the preceding music to have been aiming. And it's nice that they say we, they include us in that. We also understand it.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
essentially, the idea behind sonata theory is that a sonata is not just a template, it's a process. They view it as kind of a metaphor. Specifically, in their words, they view it as a metaphor for human action, like a human narrative or really any kind of narrative. And narratives, generally speaking, we might get into some kind of modernist thing, but generally have a teleological goal, a trajectory. So the trajectory, the goal of a sonata is this cadence.
Hmm. Okay.
So when we're struggling to accomplish something, generally we're struggling to accomplish this cadence.
But it's interesting to me that this is such a big moment then. I mean, the music just sort of races on into the closing material. It's not like Mozart sits there for a while and says, "Ah, I've reached the goal."
Well,
Uh,
he's not gauche. That would be déclassé.
but it's that's fascinating to me. I get it, and I can again mentally hear this
Mhm.
the real arrival, but it clearly just springboards us right into the what you're calling,
Yeah,
yeah, closing material, basically.
I mean, I do see what you mean. I think it is a fairly big cadence. There's a 5 6 4 progression, and then when we rock it out of it, what we get is cadential repetition. The music has become kind of like harmonically inert.
Yeah,
really
like
the only thing. Yeah, exactly. The only thing in the closing theme is 5-1, really.
mhm. Yeah.
So I think
Okay.
that can be kind of an indicator that, you know, when you're doing 5-1 and that's it, you're not accomplishing anything. You're sort of treading water.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Um, okay. Well, that no, that's very helpful, and I totally agree that this other stuff, and it really sounds like closing material in a way, with the downward arpeggios and then the rush of scales at the end.
Yeah, it's funny because it sounds it's so active,
Mhm.
but it also has no real agency.
Yeah, interesting.
Kind of to my ear, at least. I don't know.
Tonally. Yeah, tonally. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it does have the return of this lyricism in the in that little descending fourth or fifth.
Yeah. 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 Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess it's sort of treading water. And you got a pedal that's all over this pedal five.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and then another little simple cadential progression, and then we power home the B flat. Yeah,
Hmm.
that makes perfect sense. This is
Yeah.
super
So,
helpful.
well, I'm
I'm
glad,
I'm
honestly.
I'm becoming a converter to Sonata 5.
Yeah. Type 5 sonata form.
Excuse me, Type 5 sonatas.
The typology.
Sure. Am I going to read that book? Maybe you can give me the cliff notes. But
I'll give you. I don't know if I've mentioned this on the channel, so I'll mention it now actually. But if you do want to read about sonata theory, but you don't want to read an 800-page book, um, Edward Cloorman has a book called Mozart's Music of Friends, and it's about analyzing chamber music dialogically, kind of like the dialogue between instruments. It's really interesting. But he has an entire chapter that is essentially like a summary of sonata theory, and it's extremely good just as a summary, but it's also like it's definitely what I would give like an undergrad, like maybe a senior or something, to be like, this is kind of what sonata theory is, and it's informative.
and so one more thing, I'm just kind of fascinated because this is just stuff I did not learn about. When approximately when was this 800-page book written? And
Um,
did that transform the field? You know,
yeah, I mean it's sort of a field within a field because it's music theory and then it's also specifically sonata forms.
okay,
And the book really like the scope of the book is the second half of the 18th century.
okay,
So even though I do think that a lot of these techniques apply to 19th century sonata forms, they really analyze like when you look at the index of works, it's almost entirely Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven. Um, but yeah, it really it sort of changed the field. I think it's called Formenlehre now. It's really Hepokoski and Darcy who are the authors of this text, and Richard Kaplan are sort of the two opposing sides of how to analyze common practice period music.
okay. Interesting.
And it
So then,
began. I the
sorry,
year was 2006. Sorry.
2006. All right,
Yeah.
cool. Well, it's already ancient history
Yeah.
then.
This isn't even new.
I'm, I'm only about 17 years behind here. Who's counting? Okay, cool. Well,
Yeah.
this is great. So we've gotten to I don't know, do you have any more insights about the closing material? Should we move on to the solo?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think the only thing to point out is what we've already said is that there was no modulation. So what we're looking for in the upcoming solo rotation, which will have sort of all the same, we're looking for the same markers of the primary theme, the transition, the secondary theme, etc. But they may be, different, perhaps even immediately in the solo rotation.
Well, and again, this is such a more holistic way of looking at the concerto. I'm so fixated as a bassoonist and with my students on, okay, we're going to understand the form here, that's important, but we're going to look at the solo part. Like,
Yeah.
really the piece doesn't even start until the bassoon enters, you know what I mean? So
Well, there's also,
it's just you're nervous, you're just standing there nervously and it's happening and
yeah.
So yeah.
I'll tell you, I've of course I've played this and I've also taught, and a lot of times what I'm concerned with is like, can you figure out how to play the seventh measure.
Exactly, exactly. Why are your fingers so uneven? You got
Yeah.
to.
Have you tongued before? I don't know.
Exactly. Yeah. No,
But
that's true. It's a real difficult piece to pull off and make sound easy. And so this is refreshing. And we want to keep our eye on the prize here and not forget what's really significant. Once this is a communicative art, and communication, excuse me, is done through these forms, right? I mean, this is
mhm.
what the audience is hearing, and so it's really helpful to be aware of it.
Yeah. What's most notable, we might be able to blast through the soloist exposition a little bit faster,
Sure.
but what I notice immediately is the primary theme is extended by the soloist. So
Yeah.
rather than this sort of phrase fragment from the Ritornello rotation, we sort of have this fully developed kind of sentence form to the
Yep.
phrase.
And now we have that, right, rather than like a 5 bar introductory material or whatever before the transition, we've got a nice balanced sort of 8 bar statement here.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And I also think the only other thing I want to note about this is there's a 2D interjection.
Oh, this is in measure 42?
Yeah, 42.
Gotcha.
So the primary theme has happened, it's cadenced perfectly, and the orchestra is so impressed that they are kind of affirming what the soloist has accomplished. And actually, this is a common, part of Mozart's forms. They mention in their book, the close of the P theme in solo one is usually accomplished by the soloist and leads directly into a brief 2D impulse from the orchestra as the soloist momentarily drops out. And after I'll skip ahead a little bit. This kind of 2D interjection, an appended module, suggests the orchestra's suddenly interpolated commentary, usually affirmative.
Okay. I really love that. And I look, this has to be a dialogue between the soloist and the orchestra. That
Mm-hmm.
makes total sense. And as you point out, this material is actually we've heard these gestures before in the end of the orchestral exposition.
Yeah, this is not new material. This is
Yeah.
really just like the closing theme from Ritornello 1, which almost makes it seem more celebratory to me because this is material that we're used to hearing after a successful cadence.
Oh, that's neat. I like that.
So it's kind of interesting that it's sort of out of rotation, but in a way that it's like, yeah, great job, you did it.
Cool. That's great. And then let me say one thing just from a bassoonist perspective
Please.
that helps interpretively. That is not my idea, actually. It's Peter Kolke's idea, and I look up to Peter a great deal, a wonderful bassoonist. I remember him talking about the Mozart concerto and him picturing the opening. This is the bassoon, when the bassoonist enters, the opening 4 bars as this bold, kind of brash statement from an 18-year-old, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then in the lyrical 16th notes, da 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 da, that passage that follows, the next 4 bars, he kind of slips back in to his expected role in Salzburg and to the kind of conventions of the time. So we have this big
Mm.
brash entry and then a more graceful, lyrical, just easy and lovely stream of legato of
Yeah.
Zero 16ths that follows that's a little more in keeping with what he might have been expected,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is a nice, it helps interpretively to think of that first idea as bold and then try to make these 16ths just as kind of contrasting, grace flowing and
Yeah.
smooth and easy rather than continuing with that kind of bold character through them. So
It
I've always enjoyed that.
yeah, it makes me think of like, and I this is not an experience that I'm familiar with at all, but when you say something kind of aggressive and then afterwards you sort of smile, so people are just like, oh, this guy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Palatable.
Yeah. But again, I don't know what that's like. So
You would, of course, you would.
yeah. So I think another thing that changes between the rotations is the transition is different, which does make sense because we're in the soloist rotation, which means we are modulating. So
Mhm.
if we were to use the same transitional material, that would sort of be a bad sign almost, really. So what we have here is something that I think is definitely based on the primary theme. It's what Hepokoski and Darcy call a sujet libre.
And what's the translation of that?
That's a free subject, and that's not their term. That's sort of a an 18th century. I think the theorist's name is Koch,
Okay.
and he was the first one to kind of identify this like 7-part concerto form. I don't think he identified it with the sonata, but he called it a 7-part form.
One of the Koch brothers.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's hope not.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, and this is something I do remark on with students, and I've always wondered about myself. It always seemed like a weird happening here because Mozart, we end right in B flat, and then immediately boom, right into F.
Yes.
And again, this is how I learned to identify. We're in the second. This is the second theme here, or the second key area, is we have to modulate. The modulation just there's no modulation. It's just immediately in F, and of course it works because it's a related key,
Closely related.
but still um, immediately starts off in F, and it's not really this contrasting theme that I always learned to look for. It is based on that motto opening. It's really a display of arpeggios,
Yeah.
uh, and it's just always been a bit of a puzzle to me. Something that I have always thought of as kind of formally interesting about
Hmm.
this immediate transition to F, and then this kind of fast little arpeggio theme that is not was not in the opening Ritornello.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad that you mentioned this because I think that is one of the sort of failings of the way I think it's like kind of centered around like Charles Rosen's technique to sonata form. I think that's kind of one of the failings with his method is that it's so based around what key things are in.
Yeah,
So for him and his method, I think he would say, well, we're in F major, which is the dominant, so this is the secondary theme group.
I'm just that's precisely how I learned it, and
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and I do remember reading Rosen actually. Yeah, so
Hmm.
that
I
makes
have it over there actually. So,
sense.
but but I think that's sort of the difference when you kind of get into the rotational way of thinking that Hepokoski and Darcy use, where things are sort of happening within an order that you expect.
Yeah.
So, first of all, we're getting this theme that has the kind of rhetoric that we talked about with the first transition. There's sort of this increase in the energy. It's interesting. The theme is actually like it's like Mozart took the regular theme and he stretched it up and down
Mm.
because it sort of both goes higher and lower.
Right, especially we
We're,
get deep down and yeah,
yeah. So it definitely has TR rhetoric, but it's interesting to think of the soloist as having someone with the agency to modulate. Like this the cup overflows. We don't even have to modulate. We're there.
yeah. Like the
Yeah.
solo doesn't even try; they just immediately take over in whatever key they want.
Yeah.
Basically,
And I think the real key, like this happens sort of retroactively when you really hear it, that this is a transition and not the secondary theme material, happens in the section that I've labeled Ritornello 1 transition. It follows it in measure 51.
famous
And
trope for Bassoon.
exactly. And even though this is, slightly modified, I think it's very recognizably the same material from the Ritornello transition.
Wait, what? The Ritornello trans. Okay.
Yeah, the original Ritornello
Yes,
transition, which is in measure uh,
measure six.
6. Yeah, 6.
So we're comparing and again, as a bassoonist, all I know about this really is like this section is hard.
Yeah. Tell me about it.
Don't worry about the form here, man. I'm just
Yeah.
trying to do the notes, but
What's
yeah,
the sole thing in my brain when if I'm playing this is like you're falling behind. You're falling behind.
exactly. How many drills do you do, and how consistent are they? And yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Why are you falling behind? Okay, this is super interesting. I confess that I never really noticed the relationship between this part, which, yeah, of course, is part of this transition in the solo exposition, is really from the transition in the orchestral in the tutti at the beginning of the piece.
Yeah, and I think kind of recognizing that connection is what cues you into the fact that the music previously is not secondary theme. It's related to the first theme group, the primary theme,
Mm, gotcha.
if
Yeah,
that makes sense.
that makes sense. And right, this is all, as you're saying, this is all transitional material
Mhm.
on our way to the true secondary theme.
It's funny because if we stick with kind of Kolke's idea and also yours, that this is sort of like a brash
Hmm.
person who is then a little placating.
Yeah, yeah.
That's sort of how this entire transition section works because there's sort of a brash entrance where the key is changed,
Mhm.
and then we're placating the orchestra a little bit by using their transition material.
Okay.
If that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, totally. You're taking what you've been given. Of course, you're making it showier here.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
Gotta,
we
we've
are
got to
we're
have
extremely
some
important.
acrobatics. We've got to have some acrobatics, and these trills are certainly that. But yeah, that makes sense. I appreciate this. Had not made that connection before, and it makes much more sense for me to see that F major theme and that direct modulation as being. It sounds more traditional to me than
Mm-hmm.
some true second theme, which we are often looking, right? Am I okay? Maybe I'm wrong here now, but what I learned was we're looking for often a real contrasting theme, something often that's more lyrical as opposed to a more maybe exciting first idea. Does that are we still is
Yeah,
that here?
I think definitely with Mozart, the idea of sort of a more brash primary theme and a more lyrical secondary theme is true. It's not true for every composer. I think Haydn's, especially, his secondary themes tend to be like very motivic and energetic, but definitely Mozart, and I would say probably Beethoven is really who really solidified that kind of stereotype of themes. And then the truth is, we have that. It's coming. It's coming right after the medial caesura.
Okay, and again, this is another. So there's a medial caesura in both, of course, in both the tutti exposition and then the soloists episode here.
What you've no doubt noticed is that this medial caesura is different than the Ritornello medial caesura. The Ritornello medial caesura was a half cadence, which is more
Right.
normative. It sort of opens the key, but it's not a true cadence.
Yeah.
Whereas this medial caesura is an IAC, which is a much more kind of rock solid opening
Mhm.
to a medial caesura. It's sort of a sign that the key has been established. We are not in danger at all.
Right. We're clearly an F here.
Yeah, so it kind of, you know, this this soloist, if we view them as an individual, really like there's no shortage of, sort of compositional rhetorical power that they have,
Okay.
if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, totally. When you're talking about this, who's leading and who's following and who's receiving. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah, clearly this is a more substantive kind of okay, we have closure.
Yeah,
But
the cadence is more
it's
powerful.
followed again by that same gesture in the winds, the dotted
Hmm.
finger, bum ba bum bum, which is like we're ready for something else to happen here.
Yeah, yeah.
But the cadence is just firmer.
Hmm.
Yeah, that makes
And
sense.
then I think the interesting part of this secondary theme is that there's really a new theme here. It just is happening at the same time. There's the original secondary theme from the Ritornello one appears in the first violin, and the bassoonist has introduced a new theme.
The bassoonist has its own secondary theme that's not really been heard yet. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
so we really have Ritornello 1S, and then we have an additional solo 1S, and they're different themes.
gotcha.
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing that the soloist has yet again another another theme we have not heard, but it's actually placed. It accompanies, or it's excuse me, I guess it's accompanied by the the secondary theme that we heard in the Ritornello, which yeah, starting in measure, I guess pickups 11 into bar 12. Uh,
Yeah.
that's really cool. And that is something I know as a player, that's something that's pretty audible. Oh yeah, we heard that accompanying idea before in the orchestra.
Hmm.
And now we're playing something cool on top of it. Of course, what we're playing on top of it has that bum ba da da da, that little descending
Yeah, yeah.
fourth that starts with the appoggiatura. Once again, it's coming back in here. So
It's
it's not
interesting.
like foreign sound world or anything.
Yeah, they really complete each other. It's not like, you know, they go together.
Right.
Um,
So did
and
Mozart? Did he work? He worked all this stuff out in advance, or did he? Was he just composing from bar one to the end? You know, I mean, maybe
I
that's a
mean,
question.
it's sort of it's definitely hard to answer that question because when composers studied with other composers, there's no like there's no lesson book,
Yeah.
you know? So it's hard to say like was Mozart really planning this the whole time? But what I think the answer that I've been given to that question, which of course I've asked very combatively before, is
Adam, I can't imagine.
yeah. um the answer I've gotten
Adam
for that,
should have been there for our lessons, dear listener.
yeah, really. The answer that I got, which I thought was actually pretty convincing, even though it is kind of a cop out at the same time, was that the evidence is kind of in the music. Um, and what I mean by that is Mozart has so many concertos and they follow this layout,
Okay.
that, and to me, that's like, this cannot possibly be accidental,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know?
And you're talking part the formal layout, but also like, oh, these themes actually work. They work together. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that goes with the soloist having agency. Kind of what you said at the beginning was perfect with this Latin and Italian definition of these words. Like the soloist is working both together and in opposition with the orchestra.
Yeah. Yeah.
If only we had great individuals who worked together with society now. We could really use that.
Happy. Oh man. Yeah, I wouldn't
Yeah.
have.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you know, Mike, but I get pretty political on the channel.
Hey, that's fine with me. Well, I think the current leader we have is doing about as well as he can, probably in a lot of respects. But hey, uh,
Well,
not getting a
I
lot.
that is certainly a way to look at it, I guess.
Not that I'm not scared to death because the guy is 81 years old, and you know, whew,
You're not
can't,
thrilled to vote for an 82-year-old man?
you know.
um,
And my students are even less thrilled, of course, I'm sure. But
yeah, well, they and I have that in common. Um,
I'm sure.
so I think what this does have in common with the Ritornello solo theme, other than it being partially the same material, is that there's another kind of evaded PAC.
Gotcha.
So as this solo theme kind of comes to an end, and we're prepared for this cadence with this cadential 6/4 progression,
Mhm.
um, the bass evades the cadence by throwing the third into the bass line.
Right.
And then the bassoonist kind of responds. It's amazing because the bassoonist plays an F,
Mhm.
and then they sort of immediately respond and are like, okay, I guess I have to do a display
Right.
over here to get to a real cadence. And this is kind of a display episode, which is sort of like, I have been practicing, I promise.
Play episode. I love that.
Yeah, yeah.
Reminds me of a bird species displaying
Yeah,
displaying.
like a bird of paradise.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I really think that's sort of exactly what it is. Like, behold my feathers.
Magnificence. Yes.
Yeah.
Past I can play scales and turn figures.
Yeah, and then of course the orchestra is so impressed that a bassoonist can play anything quickly
Well,
that they immediately are like, okay, well, I believe you. We can cadence.
it's time to move on. Time to
Yeah,
prepare the shitty
that's
entrance.
it. That's enough. Let's go.
Yeah, the bassoon, it's not like we get that long to do our thing, really. But anyway.
When we get to the final cadence that the soloist opens, kind of with this rhetorically charged moment in the piece, like there's a trill, there's the 5/6/4. This is really, I think, kind of undeniably a big structural essential cadence, or at least that's how it sounds to me. you
Yeah.
you seemed kind of like maybe the other one wasn't, so I don't know if this is more convincing.
Well, this again because I'm so myopically focused as a player on the solo part.
Hmm.
It just okay. This is the one. If I'm thinking, where's the big cadence in the Mozart? Well, of course, it's the very end of the exposition.
Yeah. Well, and I agree. This one is stronger as a cadence.
Giant, long, high trill. It's very spectacular. I mean,
Yeah.
especially in the day with Mozart's bassoon, would have this, would have still been kind of in the high range for the instrument. So
Oh yeah. This is getting to the extreme top. I
it's a
do think I can tell you I have played a period instrument and the trill is like no big deal.
really.
You're just like, okay, whatever. Yeah.
Oh man, that's
Yeah.
interesting to know actually, because yeah, for the modern instrument, it's not the easiest.
Yeah. No, it's
Okay.
difficult for it to sound in tune. So just to continue with the soloist, the end of Solo 2, which is also the beginning of Ritornello 2, the second Ritornello,
Yeah,
the material here is again the transition material from the first Ritornello.
gotcha.
And it's sort of acting as a closing theme, but it's interesting that it is based on the transition material because what it is doing is transitioning us into the development.
I guess this is another area where my weakness in even like thinking too much about what a transition is beyond it's moving us from one place to another. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, of course, this is taking us into the development. It's presenting all these little ideas that we've heard before in the closing stuff. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think just for the listener, for clarity, Hepokoski and Darcy refer to the transition as the material that takes you from the primary theme into the medial caesura. And when material takes you between rotations, like between an expository repeat or from the exposition to the development, they call that a retransition. So that's crystal clear. I'm sure you'll agree.
Yeah, well, so no, that makes sense. So this tutti is called this whole thing is called a retransition.
Yeah, I would say it functions first as a closing theme, and then it kind of begins to be a retransition, especially when we get this kind of dominant pedal towards bar 77, 76.
Yeah. I mean, again, yeah, I think you could hear it equally as sure it's transitioning to the development. It's also clearly closing
Mm-hmm.
the exposition. It's just after the soloist ends. It's
Yeah.
like tutti closing of the exposition. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for the sake of time, what I'll say, and you can add something to this if you want to, is that Ritornello 2 is fairly short and it functions just to bring us into the development.
Yeah.
And then the development, which is solo 2, I would say is generally based on the primary theme in sort of a loose motivic way. And I
Yeah.
would say it's really an episodic kind of call and response situation between soloist and orchestra. And we're kind of going through sequences, not really in a key. You can see I've just labeled it with like jazz chords, which is my normal practice for development.
Yeah.
Um,
I this is one of these. This is often the piece that I do introduce, or sometimes anyway, the piece I introduce Sonata Form to students, and it's so textbook in the way it includes this little romp around the circle of fifths,
mhm, mhm.
and this kind of fun interplay between the. You do hear a real sense of quick back and forth dialogue, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's that's important, and if there's any place we talk about what is the orchestra doing here, again, just from my bassoonist perspective, you're looking at the development and how there's this little commentary or kind of conversation between those two forces, between the soloists and between the strings in
Yeah,
particular.
absolutely.
And it's
Um,
fun, it's clearly like showy. It does start out with that bomb bomb, that short long motto idea, but now we've
mhm.
got an octave. It's kind of transformed. Yeah, da 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 da. That the eighth notes there, I often point out to students are related to ba da 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 da. Right, the
Yes, yes.
we hear in the primary theme. So yeah, and I guess you're covering that by saying, sure, this developmental material, at least the opening, is all totally related to the theme.
Yeah. I do think it's also worth pointing out this is really kind of the only flashes of the minor mode that we get in this movement. So it's kind of inherently a little more dramatic.
Yeah.
Um, but as it ends, Ritornello 3 makes a reappearance, and this is in bar 95.
Right.
And this is sort of a very brief Ritornello 3.
Mm-hmm.
It is kind of functioning as a transition or a retransition, sorry, back into the recapitulation. And the soloist is going to do this kind of ein gong lead in.
This is one of the. This is a place where we do finally, after all the busyness of the developmental, the cascades of scales, and the arpeggios, is a place of almost stasis in a way. It just seems like
Yeah,
it's been
yeah.
still for a while here.
Mm-hmm. And then what happens as we move into the recap is it's kind of interesting because we sort of get a reiteration of the condensed Ritornello 1 primary theme. And that's followed by the soloist expansion of the primary theme. And this is what Hepokoski and Darcy call a double recapitulation. There's
Okay.
no there's no recapitulation that is only the tutti or only the soloist. This one opens tutti and then it also opens soloist right afterwards.
Right. Okay. Yeah, we hear the horns return with the theme. Our
Mm-hmm.
horn friends often will crack the first note or two because they've been
Yeah.
resting too long.
It's been about 30 measures, so
All
it's
right, it's
okay.
been a long time. I'm used to those some splias there at the beginning,
Yeah.
and then the bassoonist, yeah, comes right in and finishes the statement, as you say. That's
Mhm.
cool. So is this typical for?
Recaps happen in different ways. Sometimes much more of it will be the Ritornello, like almost the entire first primary theme zone up until the medial caesura. But there are also things like there's this concept in sonata theory of merging sections. So you sometimes find Ritornello 3, Solo 3 merge, where they're really doing it together.
Yeah.
And I think I'll put this in the description, but if anyone is familiar with the most popular video on my channel, it has 1.6 thousand views.
That's a lot for a music
Um,
video.
exactly. That's my analysis of a Mozart piano concerto, and there is a Ritornello 3 Solo 3 merge in that piece.
Okay, and so you're saying that's what's happening here, basically.
Well, they call it a double recapitulation. Basically, that it starts with the tutti and then the soloist kind of takes the reins. And I really don't think, you know, in terms of the transition, I'm not sure there's much more to talk about until we get to the the second sujet lieb. This is the soloist 3 transition 3 in measure 126. And this is really identifiably new material.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. These upward scales.
Mm-hmm. And it's sort of quasi display episode, quasi sujet lieb. It's a transition that is really moving kind of again through the circle of fifths back to the tonic. And I kind of think of it as kind of reinvigorating the tonal drama of the recapitulation
Right.
because of course in the initial exposition the drama is that you're modulating,
Mhm.
which in a recap you sort of lose that dramatic trajectory.
Yeah.
So having a transition that kind of refocuses on the subdominant to move back to the tonic is kind of a way of injecting some
Okay.
joie de vivre.
Measure 126, where we start in E flat.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's modulated to E flat, but
Right.
we're on that
But
chord.
it starts this romp around yeah, we hear that four really clearly, and then it starts going around this.
Yeah, it's very satisfying to play on the bassoon with that
It
very
is.
very stable kind of
And I
fingering.
did want to ask you again. I just haven't studied the breadth of material. Um, you know, this has struck me that this is a new idea plopped down in there. That's a kind of a new showy idea in the
Yeah,
and I wonder how common that is to have brand new themes introduced by the soloist in the recapitulation.
it's very common actually. I would say in this concerto, it happens less than is usual.
Okay,
I would say it's more usual for there to be a lot more distinct solo introduced themes.
gotcha.
And I think we can probably chalk that up to this maybe being, of course, this is like almost juvenilia because Mozart is 18, but also, how much time did he really dedicate to this? I
Okay,
don't know.
it's a bassoon concerto. I mean, come on.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I don't know what I'm thinking. He probably was tossing and turning at night thinking about it.
But
But
yeah, these scales are fun and satisfying to play, and you're in a way you're through the really a lot of the hard stuff. So
yeah. Well, and of course, the whole thing becomes easy if you give up and just start slurring everything.
which we are
So,
wont to do.
but that essentially brings us into a medial caesura that is similar to the soloist iteration of the medial caesura. We have another IAC, and then it's kind of met with this clearing of the way by the winds. What is different, though, is that what had formerly been the bassoonist secondary theme and what had formerly been the tutti solo secondary theme are now reversed.
Right.
So the soloist has the
Revolution.
original Ritornello secondary theme, and the orchestra now has the bassoon iteration, which is kind of interesting.
And I think that's such a nice way to sense that this piece is sort of starting to come to a close because it's so jovial and free
Mm-hmm.
and so opera. This to me kind of is very opera buffa, uh,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and we just haven't gotten to really do that yet. It's a really wonderful moment to play.
Mm-hmm. The whole piece is very. I mean, maybe it's just that's just what I associate Mozart with, but it feels very operatic to me, very dramatic and declamatory, and at
Well,
times comic.
yeah, and famously the second movement, it
Yeah,
kind of
Porgy and More.
became an aria
Yeah,
later.
could have been worse,
Okay,
I guess.
so we're talking about flipping of these
Oh,
roles.
yeah. So what I was going to say was this is interesting because you mentioned like this is kind of a sign that we're coming to the end, and
Yeah,
that really is how I think about it. This like the oppositional aspect of this concerto is coming to a close, and we're now working together.
gotcha. Because we've traded roles and yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like I'm in your shoes, you're in my shoes, and I'm like, hey, give me back my shoes, and then we cadence.
Just summed up the piece, Dan.
Exactly. But having said that, there is still a little like he does the same kind of trick again. I think this is something I definitely think about Mozart as doing very regularly. He does not change his recaps that much. There's a lot of correspondence with his expositions, whereas a composer like Haydn and even Beethoven, the recap changes in a way that makes you feel like you've really gone on a well, maybe a little bit more of a journey. I don't know.
So you're saying he's basically still utilizing mainly the same material.
Yeah, and in evidence of my claim, I point to the fact that this evaded cadence is still here,
Ah,
and this is in
that's
bar
that's
145.
45. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. And then we've got another display episode.
yeah, brief display episode, and it really ends in kind of the same way. This trill cadence, this 5/6/4, and then I would say, even though there is more to this piece and there's going to be potential repetition, I would say this is the structural cadence.
Right here in bar 152.
Yes, 152. In my
Okay.
score, it says 2D. I don't know if it does in yours.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
And I
And
would
then
say this is Ritornello 4.1.
4.1, that means there's going to be a 4.2.
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought that up. In sonata theory, the four and the point one refers to the fact that the ritornello will be in two parts, and it's basically pre and post cadenza.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. So the
Yeah.
4.1 is what brings us into this big structural cadential 6/4 that the bassoonist then resolves through their cadenza. They're a second episode displaying their feathers and their dancing ability.
Yeah.
And then it cadences in bar 161.
And then
So
there's which is Ritornello 4.2.
Yeah, and in some concertos, there's not so much synergy between the soloist and the orchestra. So, in a concerto like the one that I've analyzed before on my channel, where there isn't necessarily a clear structural cadence before the cadenza, what the cadenza really operates is as kind of like a Hail Mary pass made by the soloist. Like, this is our last chance. We have to cadence here
Right.
because otherwise we won't be able to cadence together. But in this
But
one, the stakes are a little bit lower.
here we did.
Yeah.
Well, look, I've never felt like this concerto. This is on a larger scale, not just referring to the ending here, but
Mm-hmm.
I've never felt like this concerto feels like some really oppositional thing. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
always felt like a pretty harmonious dialogue, and then we have the fun give and take in the development, and then things are pretty much in agreement here, as opposed to being some tug of war kind of a feeling.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about even later Mozart concertos, especially in minor keys, and certainly in Beethoven ones,
Yeah,
there's a lot of drama between the soloist and the orchestra. And yeah, I would agree. This one's more like easy breezy, beautiful sonata theory.
and it's such a we're just so lucky to have it. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
we all as bassinists get a little tired of it, but then every time I re-encounter it or look at it in this way, it becomes exciting to me again, at least at some level. It's just a wonderful piece. Mozart's very
Yeah.
first wind concerto, right? Which is
I I feel like that's almost situational because I feel like if you take it out of the situation of how much of a nightmare auditions can be,
yeah,
it's very obviously like just a fun piece.
yeah,
But when
yeah.
you throw it in a pot with like, oh my God, that's when it becomes like, okay.
Serious endeavor, and so oh,
Mhm.
I gotta practice the Mozart for the 850th time.
For literally a decade, I've been doing this.
Yeah, exactly. And it can feel like a chore. It can feel like you take it for granted.
Mhm.
It's great music, as you say. Yeah, harmonious and playful, and really emblematic of that kind of Mozart. Again, coming back to the idea of Mozart as a young man here, being this brash, but also already completely assimilated and going beyond, in some respects, the courtly music of his day. So.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would definitely agree with that. I feel like he's sort of a breakout. I mean, hot take, Mozart is kind of a unique and good composer. Yeah, that's the position of this channel. I don't know.
You'll have to sell me on that one.
Yeah.
Although, as I know we've discussed before, there's so many other good ones that
Yeah.
get neglected, probably partly because of the dominance of the big
Mhm.
three, the Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven. And
Yeah, and if anyone in the audience is feeling how dare they pay lip service to this idea that there are other composers but not actually put their money where their mouth is, just check my catalog. There
okay,
are several women composers, Italians, there's a Dutchman. I mean, there's a lot going on. We really delve into the catalog.
awesome. Well, yeah, I want to talk more about some pieces you recommend, in particular. But yeah, this is really great to take another look at the Mozart and finally, for me, get some kind of handle on what is happening analytically, formally.
Mhm.
As I mentioned, some elements have always been a little puzzling to me. So
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. And that's kind of a good way to wrap up, I think. That's what I like about sonata theory. I feel like, people sort of I think the labeling conventions and how complicated they are can kind of be a turnoff.
yeah,
But what they provide is a level of specificity that allows you to be very interpretive.
right, right.
Um, and that's
But
what I like about it personally.
yeah,
I don't
looking at the idea of the rotation of these kind of basic parts
know. Mm-hmm.
is beautiful, and it does seem a little more descriptive about what's really important and what we hear as listeners, rather than just like, okay, where's the one, and then where's five, and then where's
Yeah, yeah,
uh, and this is a contrasting theme, and this is so yeah, this has been really helpful for me. So,
Great. No, I'm glad. I think this was a great conversation. I hope it'll be entertaining.
well, thanks, Dan.
So, yeah. So that was a conversation with Dr. Michael Harley, doctor, and this was Sonata She Wrote. And I post videos every 2 weeks on my channel and once a month a video on my Patreon for patrons only. If you can support the channel, that's at patreon.com/Sonata She Wrote.